One dawn in late April, I opened my cabin door and found pine cones stacked on the porch in the shape of a small heart. Weeks after that, I went into Elk Creek during breakup flood and pulled an injured young Bigfoot out of black water and snare cable. By the end of spring, an adult from the timber stood on my threshold and watched me like a man being measured, not hunted. I'd come back to Goat Rocks to settle my mother's place and disappear quietly. But what happened there changed the direction of my life without asking permission. I was 31 when I returned, and I carried 2 keys on my ring. One for my truck, one for a cabin door my mother had opened for 30 years. She died in February from a stroke in Yakima, fast and without long speeches, and the county mailed me forms that used words like estate and transfer and parcel. 2 summers before her death, I lost Eli Navarro in a burnover on the Cispus side, and after that, I stopped answering most calls. When I drove up the gravel track through wet fir and alder, there was no one waiting at the end of it. Scout met me under the lean-to, old blue heeler coat gone silver at the muzzle, and leaned his weight against my shin as if I had only been gone a day. The cabin sat above Elk Creek on a bench of dark soil and stone, half-sided in cedar, half in tin, patched by my mother with roofing nails and patience. A lower fence ran along the waterside where spring rise could chew away posts if you let it. There was no service on my phone unless I hiked 2 ridges east, and I had no reason to hike there unless I needed weather reports or parts numbers. No close neighbors, no steady traffic. Just a logging road 2 miles out and the sound of rain moving through branch tops before it hit the roof. I set my routine by first light because routine held shape when nothing else did. I split fir rounds behind the shed before sunrise, breath white in the beam of my headlamp, maul striking on grain my mother had marked in chalk. I cleaned ash from the wood stove and carried it to the garden edge, where she used to work rows of beans and onion. I checked fence wire along the creek with lineman pliers in my back pocket and a roll of staples in my coat. I cooked eggs or potatoes in her chipped cast-iron skillet and ate standing up by the sink. Scout followed me through all of it, close enough that I learned to step wider at doors. He had one torn ear from before I got him, and a way of watching timber lines longer than I did. In the evenings I talked to him because there was no one else to talk to, and silence could get heavy if I let it stack too high. "Fence held last night," I told him one wet evening while I wiped mud off my boots with a flat stick. He sat by the stove and blinked once. "Tomorrow we clear the drainage trench." His tail thumped the floor twice. That was enough conversation for both of us. By the second week of March, the chores had settled into muscle memory. I could tell which board would creak before I stepped on it. I knew how long coffee took on that stove from first bubble to rolling boil. I knew where my mother kept spare baling wire, spare lantern wicks, spare everything. At night, I wrote small notes in an old smoke jumper pocket notebook, because field notes had saved me more than once when weather went bad and memory got thin. Wind direction, creek height at dusk, fence repairs done and not done. What I cooked, what Scout refused to eat. Grief did not arrive like weather for me. It came like an old injury. Most days I could move around it if I moved carefully. Then some small thing would catch, and I would feel Eli again in the heat and roar. Hear him yelling over rotor wash at base in August. See him laughing with ash all over his teeth because he said no one smiled clean in fire season. I saw my mother too at the table by the west window with her mending basket, humming one line of a church song and never finishing it. So I kept my hands busy. Competence kept the day from opening up under me. The first odd sign came at dusk, separate and plain. Scout stood by the porch rail facing the alder line and growled low in his chest. He did not bark. His hackles rose, then settled, then rose again. I stepped out with a flashlight and swept the beam over wet trunks, salmonberry, sword fern, nothing else. The rain was steady and thin, and the beam caught it in silver threads. "Easy," I said. Scout did not move. He stared another full minute, then came back inside and lay where he could still see the door. 3 days passed before the next sign showed itself. I walked down to the water trough above the lower pasture with a sack of mineral and found tracks in the mud beside it. Not hooves, not bare. The impressions were broad at the front, tapered at the heel, and set in a line with stride too long for any man walking easy through slick ground. I knelt, set my carpenter's ruler across the widest print, and measured just over 7 inches at the ball, almost 14 inches heel to toe. I marked the number in the notebook. I drew the track shape in pencil and arrowed the direction north-northwest toward thicker cedar. I circled once and looked for claw marks. None. I checked for boot tread. None. I stood there a while with rain ticking on my hood and watched water collect in each impression until the edges softened. At noon that same day, I found peeled bark on a young cedar near the creek bend, stripped in long vertical ribbons. A few yards farther, 2 saplings were snapped and twisted, not cut, not wind-thrown, bent as if someone had gripped and turned until fibers gave way. The twist marks looked handmade to me, though I did not write that line down. I wrote location, tree type, and height from ground. I tied survey tape to a branch so I could find it again and kept moving, because that was what a workday asked for. Repair what failed, note what changed, do the next thing. By late March, small food losses began. 1 apple from the porch crate. Next night, 2 strips of jerky from the pan rack near the shed door. A week later, 1 jar of honey gone from a stack of supplies I had just inventoried. No broken latches, no claw gouges, no scattered trash, no torn sacks, no mess the way raccoons leave a place. Just missing items, clean and selective. I changed where I stored food and watched for patterns. I dusted the porch boards with a little dry flour before dark one night, enough to catch prints if anything crossed. Morning rain erased most of it before first light, but under the eave there were 2 partial impressions, long and soft at the edge, no boot tread, no paw pads. I measured those too. I entered each one in the notebook with date and weather and creek level. I did not tell town. There was no one in town I wanted to tell. The feed store clerk would smile and nod and file it under cabin fever. The deputy would drive up once, walk my porch, and suggest I secure my food better. Both of them would mean well. Neither of them would help. The woods changed tone as March turned to April. Birds still called at daybreak, but evening settled faster and flatter. Deer stopped using one side of the lower path and shifted their tracks upslope. Scout listened more than he slept. I found myself pausing in the yard for no clear reason, hands still, head turned toward timber, waiting for a sound that did not come. Something felt off, the kind of quiet that did not sit right. Still, I kept the routine. Split, sweep, patch, cook, check wire, note weather. I worked the drainage trench above the creek with shovel and hoe to clear winter debris before flood season. I reset 2 loose posts with crushed rock at the base. I sharpened my axe and hung it by the mudroom door where I could grab it blind. I set rope coils dry on pegs. I told myself those were standard spring tasks, nothing more than that. And, mostly, it was true. On the first clear dawn after 4 days of rain, I opened the cabin door with coffee in my hand and saw the pine cones. 7 of them, dry and chosen for size, arranged on the porch boards in a small heart no wider than my spread hand. They sat just left of the threshold where I could not miss them, points turned inward, balanced carefully so the shape held. No wind could have done it. No squirrel could have done it. Scout stood at my knee, nose working, tail still, and looked from the heart to the alder line without a sound. I did not touch the pine cones right away. I set my cup down on the rail and crouched with my palms on my thighs. The grain of the porch boards was damp under my boots. A jay called once from uphill. Far below, Elk Creek carried snowmelt in a hard, steady voice. I took the notebook from my jacket, wrote the date, wrote the time, wrote exactly what I saw, and underlined one line once. Intentional placement. Near door. No sign of forced entry or disturbance. Then I sat on the top step beside Scout until the coffee cooled, looking at that small heart and listening to the timber breathe around us. I stayed on that step until the steam quit rising off my cup and the damp reached through my jeans. Scout leaned his shoulder against my shin and watched the alders the same way he watched a gate left unlatched. I reached out at last and touched one pine cone at the point. It was dry under my thumb, not rain-soaked like the boards around it, and it smelled of resin and clean pitch. I lifted each one carefully and set them in an old enamel bowl by the sink. I did not want them kicked apart by accident. I wrote that down too, where I stored them, and then I rinsed the coffee pot and set about the day because the day had its own demands whether I understood anything or not. I split wood until my palms stung through gloves and stacked the rounds bark side out beneath the lean-to. I checked the stovepipe seam, then climbed down and shoveled wet duff from the drainage swale near the east wall. When I walked the lower fence, Scout ranged 10 yards ahead and doubled back every minute, as if counting me. The creek ran hard and brown from melt, carrying needles and one dead branch as long as a canoe paddle. By noon, I was in the mudroom with my mother's old toolbox open, replacing hinge screws on the pantry door she used to slam with her hip when her hands were full. Her handwriting was still on masking tape labels inside the cabinets. Flour, rice, dry beans. She had rounded the corners of each letter like she had rounded every sharp edge in that place. I stood there with a screwdriver in my hand and looked too long at the word T. Black marker faded to grey. It felt like finding her voice caught in the wood grain. I put the screws in straight and closed the cabinet softly. That evening, I fried potatoes and onion in the cast-iron skillet until the edges browned, then gave Scout the last 2 forkfuls after they cooled. Rain came at dark in a low, steady sheet. I latched the door, banked the stove, and sat at the table with my notebook and a topographic map spread flat under a glass jar so the corners would not curl. I marked where I had found the twist-broken saplings. I marked where the heart had been placed. I drew a loose line between them and stopped. I was not mapping an enemy. I was tracking change. "Lights out," I told Scout when I stood up. He rose with a grunt, circled twice on his bed, and settled facing the door. By mid-April, I had fallen into a rhythm so fixed I could have done it in the dark. Wake before first light. Stir coals, add split fir, set kettle. Feed Scout, sweep ash. Shoulder tools, walk wire. Return, cook, patch, stack, note. In the afternoons, I worked on the lower drainage trench with a trenching shovel and mattock, widening the outflow where spring surge usually backed up against silt. I laid flat rock by hand to keep the lip from sloughing in a heavy rain. My back ached by evening, and my mind stayed quieter when my body was tired. Grief still moved through on its own schedule. Sometimes it came while I was doing simple things, like hanging socks by the stove line. Eli would be there in my head with his hard hat pushed back and his grin full of soot, telling me to quit babying wet boots because leather did not bruise. Other times it was my mother at the sink, shoulders narrow in that plaid shirt she wore until the cuffs thinned out, asking without looking up if I had eaten enough to make it through the morning. I never answered either of them aloud. I just reached for the next task and kept my hands moving. 2 mornings after I found the pinecone heart, I carried feed to the shed and stopped short at the threshold. 3 nails sat on the plank floor in a neat row, all the same length, points facing the same direction. I knew I had left that floor clean. I knew because I had swept it the night before and cursed one warped board the whole time. I crouched, looked for track marks in the dust, and found only a faint drag where something had been set down, not dropped. I picked the nails up and put them in my shirt pocket. I did not write monster or man in my notebook. I wrote row of 3 nails, aligned inside shed doorway. No other disturbance. That night, near midnight, Scout gave one low growl without lifting his head. It came from deep in his chest, then stopped. I was awake at once, listening through the rain hiss and stove tick. There was a sound outside, not hoof and not paw. A careful pressure on wet boards near the porch rail, then a pause long enough for me to count 5 breaths. I did not rush the door. I sat up in bed and waited with my hand on the flashlight until the sound moved away toward the alders. In the morning, there were no tracks on the porch because rain had worked the boards clean, but one thing had changed. The enamel bowl by the sink still held 6 pine cones. The 7th lay by the back door, placed beside Scout's water pan as if someone had reconsidered where it belonged. I set it back with the others and left it there. 3 days passed without a sign, and I almost convinced myself I had pushed ordinary things into a strange shape. Then the weather shifted. Cold rain turned to sleet for half a day, then back to rain that hammered the tin roof in broad, heavy drops. Creek noise climbed another notch. The lower pasture took on that grey shine it got before standing water. I spent the afternoon resetting a fence brace and came in soaked through to the knees. When I opened the porch crate for potatoes, I found the burlap folded back, not untied, and 1 potato missing from the centre, not the top. Beside the crate sat a cedar sprig, stripped clean except for 1 green tuft at the tip. It had been laid crosswise over the lid like a mark. Scout sniffed it, sneezed once, and looked up at me. "You saw more than I did," I said. He blinked and leaned against the crate, still watching timber. I started handling evenings differently after that. Not reckless, not theatrical, just deliberate. At dusk, I peeled 2 extra potatoes, boiled them until soft, and set them on a flat stump at the edge of the yard where the grass gave way to sword fern. I stood there a moment with the empty pot in my hand, feeling the rain bead on my collar, then went back inside without looking over my shoulder. In the morning, the stump was clean. No peels, no scatter, no bite marks. On the centre of the stump were 2 short willow sticks placed in a narrow X, bark scraped off at the crossing as if pressed together and turned. I did not touch them until after I had looked all around the clearing. Then I lifted both sticks and carried them in with 2 fingers, like evidence. I wrapped them in a piece of wax paper and wrote the date on the fold. Stored on top pantry shelf, left side. The day stayed low and dim, clouds hanging in the fir crowns. I worked in the woodshed, sharpening my axe and hatchet with a puckstone while Scout slept against a stack of split rounds. Around noon he woke and stared toward the creek side, ears forward, body still. He did not growl this time. He listened, then lay back down. His calm settled me more than any explanation could have. By the 3rd week of April, I had a pattern whether I wanted one or not. I left food at dusk on the same stump. Some nights, it was potatoes. One night, it was half a salmon fillet from a fish I had smoked over alder chips. Another night, it was 2 apples and a strip of jerky. By first light, the food was always gone, taken cleanly. Not once did I find scattered scraps. Not once did I find tracks clear enough to claim in wet ground. In return, small things appeared in places where chance had no business. A raven feather laid on the porch rail, quill pointed toward the door. A stack of 3 smooth creek stones on the top fence post by the gate, balanced too carefully to be from runoff. A length of peeled willow set against the mudroom step with one end split and braided around itself. I noted each item and where it appeared. I drew quick sketches in the notebook margins. I stored the feather in a mason jar so Scout would not mouth it. The stones I left where they were for 1 full day, then moved them to the porch table before rain could knock them off. At the end of one long, wet afternoon, I walked down to the trough with a tape measure and camera from my jump bag. Fresh prints showed in the black mud beyond the overflow spout. Deeper this time, longer stride. I set the tape beside one and took 2 photos from different angles, then one with my boot next to it for scale. While I worked, Scout stood upslope, body angled between me and the alder line. He kept glancing back, urging me without sound to finish and move. We moved. That night, I cleaned the camera lens and scrolled the images by lamplight. The print edges were sharp enough to count toe impressions. No claws. The heel was narrow, then widened abruptly through the midfoot. It looked built for weight and balance on rough ground, not speed on open flat. I wrote all that down as observation only. I did not write what I suspected because I still did not trust the shape of that thought. 4 days later, just after sunset, I found the pine cones again. Not 7 this time. 5, arranged on the porch step in a tighter heart than before, one point aimed straight at my boots. Beside the heart lay a second raven feather darker than the first, with a strip of pale down still clinging near the base. No other mark, no sound in the trees, just that small shape waiting in the dim. I crouched and rested my hand on Scout's neck. His coat was warm and dry from the stove. He did not growl, he did not pace. He watched the alders, then he looked at me, and his tail tapped once against the step. I set my palm flat on the wet wood beside the pine cones and listened to Elk Creek rolling below us in the dark. Curiosity had replaced the old edge in me by then, not because the woods were safe, but because someone out there had answered every careful act with one of their own. I could feel the routine shifting under my feet, plank by plank, into something I had not planned but could no longer deny. I stayed crouched beside that second pine cone heart until rain soaked through my sleeves. The porch lamp was off. Only stovelight pushed a faint square through the window behind me. Scout rose, shook once, and stood with his chest against my leg, eyes on the alder line. A branch moved where no wind reached. Not a sway across the whole canopy, just one section of vine maple folding down and lifting back. I stood slowly, knees stiff, and kept my hands where they were. Scout gave a low sound in his throat, then went quiet. We listened to Elk Creek and rain tapping the tin roof, and a second sound below both of them, soft weight in wet leaf litter, measured and even, moving left to right along the timber edge. I did not step off the porch. I did not call out. The sound passed and faded. Then the woods held still again, flat and watchful. I carried the pine cones inside one at a time and set them in the same enamel bowl. I latched the door and banked the stove lower than usual so the cabin would not throw too much light. Scout settled by the threshold, not asleep, not restless. Around midnight he lifted his head and stared at the door for a long minute, then laid it back down. Nothing touched the boards. By first light the rain had broken into mist. I walked the yard with coffee in my hand and checked the stump, the crate, the shed door, the trough trail. No fresh sign showed clear enough to read. Ground that had held tracks yesterday was slick and glazed by the night's rain. I moved through chores without speaking, split 8 rounds, swept ash, checked the lower fence staples, and came back with mud to my knees, and that same steady pressure between my shoulder blades that said I was not working alone anymore. By the next evening, clouds hung low on the ridge, and the rain came back in narrow bands. I boiled 2 potatoes, set them on the flat stump at the edge of the fern, and returned to the porch rail instead of going inside. Scout stood close, shoulder brushing my calf. The light drained out of the clearing by inches. Cedars turned from green to dark slate. Then I saw it. At first it was only shape and interruption, a vertical weight where rain should have fallen straight through. 40 yards out, maybe a little more, just beyond the stump and behind a screen of vine maple. Shoulders high and broad, head low between them. No shine from eyes at that distance, no colour I could name in that weather, only dark against darker timber, and a stillness that looked deliberate, not startled. My hand tightened on the porch rail. Every nerve in me lit at once, the way it used to before a wind shift on a fire line. Fear came hard and clean. So did something else that felt like standing at the rim of a canyon and seeing how far it dropped. Scout did not bark. He pressed against me and watched. The figure angled half a step, enough that one side showed clearer through the rain seam. Arm length wrong for bear, posture wrong for elk, for any animal I knew on this slope. It stood for 3 breaths, maybe 4. Then it turned and moved uphill in 3 quiet strides. Not running, not crouching. Just gone into cedar shadow where the rain and branches took the outline apart. I kept staring at the spot, long after it had disappeared. When I could move again, I went down to the stump. The potatoes were gone. On the wet wood, centered where they had been, lay 1 willow cross and a small twist of grass tied around its middle. The knot was simple and tight. Human hands would have tied it that way. I picked it up, felt the wet fibers bite my fingertips, and stood there listening to my own breathing. "Inside," I said to Scout, voice rougher than I expected. He turned at once and headed for the door. At the table, I opened the smoke jumper notebook and wrote until the page margin ran out. Time, weather, distance estimate, direction of travel, body proportions as best I could judge through rain and cover. I wrote 1 line, then crossed out 2 words and replaced them with plain ones. Dark, bipedal figure. No aggressive movement. Withdrew on its own. I set the willow cross on wax paper beside the earlier one. Then I took the camera from my jump bag, checked the batteries, wiped the lens and placed it by the door with a dry cloth. Not for proof to anyone else, for memory that would hold shape later. 3 days passed before I saw it again, and in those 3 days the routine grew narrower and more exact. I left food at dusk at the same stump and stepped back to the same place by the porch rail. I stood there until light failed, then went in. Scout kept watch beside me each time. On the first of those evenings, the food vanished after full dark. When I checked at dawn, 2 smooth stones sat on the stump lip, balanced one atop the other. On the second evening, rain drowned all sound but creak and roof. Dawn showed a cedar sprig laid in a circle no wider than my fist. On the third evening, the sky cleared enough for a dull red line in the west. By then, the last week of April had settled cold in the hollows, and steam rose off Elk Creek at sunset. I set out half a salmon fillet and 1 apple, then rested both hands on the porch rail and waited. The shape appeared sooner than before. Same corridor through cedar and vine maple. Same distance. This time it did not stay fully behind cover. I could make out a torso tapering at the waist, heavy forearms and long dark hair lying matted by rain along one shoulder. It stood with one foot slightly forward, weight balanced, head turned toward me. I felt fear again, but not the blind edge of it, more like a current running under everything else. "It is okay," I said, barely above a whisper. The figure held where it was. Scout gave one low huff, then quieted and sat down at my boot. We stayed that way until the light dropped too far for details. I did not move closer. The figure did not move closer. When I blinked moisture out of my eyes and looked again, it had stepped back into the trees and was gone. I slept badly that night and woke before the alarm. At first light, the stump was empty of food. In its place was a raven feather pinned under a strip of peeled willow, set so the quill pointed toward the porch. I carried both inside and set them with the others. The collection on my pantry shelf had started to look less like odd debris and more like conversation. 2 afternoons later, I walked the north fence line with pliers and staples, mending a sag where winter runoff had undercut one post. Scout stayed unusually close and kept turning his head upslope as if checking for movement. When we finished, I stood and looked toward the timber pocket where I had seen the figure twice. The slope there held old cedar stumps and nurse logs, soft with moss. Easy cover, clear sightline to my porch, hard footing even in wet weather. By then, I had stopped asking myself if I was imagining it. The question had moved to what terms this contact would follow, and whether I could keep my side of them simple and steady. That evening, I changed one thing. I still left food on the stump, but after setting it down, I took one slow step off the porch and stood in the open yard with my hands visible at my sides. Scout remained on the top step. He watched me, then the trees, then me again. Rain had not started yet. The clearing held that thin grey light right before dusk drops into full dark. I could hear a thrush downhill and the distant rattle of small stones rolling in the creek current. A shape separated from the cedars. Not abrupt, not a rush. It was simply there as if the forest had decided to release it by degrees. Tall, dark, broad through chest and shoulders, hair hanging in uneven lengths, face still mostly shadowed by distance and branch cover. It stood just beyond the stump and looked at me. Every part of me wanted to calculate exits and tools and angles. Another part, older and quieter, said, "Stay still." I stayed still. Scout did not growl. The figure lowered its head a fraction, then reached down, took the salmon fillet in one hand, and stepped back. The movement was efficient and careful, fingers long and curved, grip precise. It did not snatch, it did not posture. It just withdrew one pace and held. I took one step backward toward the porch, then another. I kept my eyes on it and lifted my empty hands once, palms out before lowering them. The figure watched, then shifted weight and turned sideways, presenting less profile like an animal easing pressure in a close space. It moved into cedar shadow and disappeared. I did not follow. I sat down on the step where my knees gave out and rubbed Scout's shoulder until my breathing settled. "Well done, old man," I said to him. He leaned against me and exhaled through his nose. From then on, I kept the same hour each dusk with more care than any task on the property. Food on the stump. 2 steps into the yard. Hands open. Wait. Some evenings nothing showed and I went in when the light failed. Some evenings I caught movement only, a dark line between trunks. On 2 evenings I saw the full shape at distance, always near the same trees, always quiet, always gone before true dark. By the first day of May the pattern had hardened. Every night, same time, same place, it returned in one form or another. Sometimes it took the food while I watched, Sometimes it waited until I went inside. In return, objects arrived with intent that no weather could explain. A pair of crossed willow sticks left on the porch rail. 3 pine cones nested in a shallow bowl shape on the top step. A crow feather laid beside Scout's water pan, dry despite overnight rain because it had been placed under the eave. I stored what needed protecting. I left what seemed meant to remain outside. One evening, under a pale, clearing sky, I stepped out with boiled potatoes and found the figure already there at the timber edge before I reached the stump. It held position, neither advancing nor retreating. I set the potatoes down, straightened, and met its gaze through 40 yards of damp air and fern. No sound passed between us, no gesture beyond breathing. Trust did not arrive all at once. It built like fence work, one staple at a time, each one set in quiet and checked before moving on. By the time dark took that evening, I understood we had begun something that depended on consistency more than courage. So I lifted the empty pot, backed to the porch without turning away, and let the woods decide the rest for the night. I lifted the empty pot and took one more step back, just as I had the nights before. The figure took the potatoes and slipped into cedar shadow. I stood on the porch until dark went full and the stump disappeared. Scout stayed pressed to my left boot. When we went in, I set the pot in the sink, wrote the time in my notebook, and marked one line under it. Full visual contact at dusk. No threat display. Deliberate withdrawal. Rain started again while I was writing. At first it was a light ticking on the tin roof. Then it thickened into broad drops that hit hard enough to blur the window glass. I checked the creek gauge stick with my flashlight from the porch. Water had climbed 3 inches since late afternoon. I banked the stove, coiled dry rope by the mudroom door, and set my axe where I could reach it in the dark. Those were break-up habits my mother drilled into me. Do not wait until the water is at your ankles. By 10, Elk Creek was loud enough to hear through stove crackle. Scout did not settle. He paced from door to window and back, claws tapping boards in a tight rhythm. He stopped once at the back door and gave a short, sharp whine that did not sound like fear. It sounded like urgency. I stood up and listened. Outside, the rain hissed in sheets. Under it, I heard one heavy splash from the creek side, then another, then silence. "Stay close," I told Scout. I pulled on rain gear, clipped my headlamp on, and stepped out with the flashlight in my left hand. Cold rain hit the back of my neck and ran down my collar. The beam caught fence posts, wet grass, alder trunks. At the yard edge, just beyond the stump, a dark shape stood half-turned toward me. Not the posture I had seen at dusk. This one shifted weight, looked toward the creek, then back at me. It took 3 quick steps downhill and stopped again. The motion was clear as any hand signal on a fire line. I did not call out. I ran back inside, grabbed rope, axe, and the small field tin from my jump bag. I added 2 clean towels, a wool blanket, and lineman pliers from the mudroom shelf. Scout was already at the door, body taut, eyes bright. We moved downhill together into rain and black timber. By a little after midnight, the lower bench was waterlogged and shining under my lamp. The side channel that stayed shallow most springs had turned into a hard, fast chute. Debris rode the current in bursts, sticks, bark slabs, one length of rotten fence rail. The dark figure I had followed stood on higher ground by a cottonwood, broad shoulders angled toward the water. It did not approach. It held position and watched me. Then my light caught the young one. It was wedged against a cottonwood snag where the side channel bent. One leg was twisted under it. A cable ran from that leg into mud and vanished under brown water. The current shoved at its chest and neck each time a surge came through. Its head lifted once, then dropped. I heard a low sound, almost swallowed by water noise, and Scout gave a tight growl that ended in a whine. I moved closer to the bank and saw the cable clearer. Old snare line, heavy gauge, likely set years ago and buried deep by silt. The loop had caught high on the calf and drawn tight. Every pull from the current cinched it more. Water was rising by inches. The snag was already flexing with each surge. I looked at the channel, black, fast, full of hidden holes. I looked at the young one, then at the big figure standing under cedar shadow above me. The adult did not charge. It did not bluff. It stood with both arms low and still, like a witness waiting for a verdict. For one long second, I was back in fire again, hearing the wind flip and feeling heat hit my face shield. Same split in the road. Run now, live with it later, or step in and take what comes. I tied one end of the rope to a lower fence post I had set in rock 2 weeks earlier. I wrapped the other end around my waist and clipped it off with a trucker hitch. I handed Scout the coil tail and pointed upslope. Back, stay. He backed 3 paces and planted, trembling but obedient. The first step into the channel took my breath. Water slammed my thighs and pushed hard for my knees. I braced with my left shoulder into the current and drove the axe head into mud for purchase. 2 more steps, and I reached the snag. The young one's fur was slick and dark with water. Its eyes opened, unfocused, then fixed on me with a stunned, exhausted look. It tried to pull free and the cable bit deeper. "Easy," I said. "Hold still." My words meant little, but tone mattered. I kept it low and even. I got one hand under the cable where it crossed the leg. No slack. I chopped once at the exposed section and sparks kicked off steel. Bad angle. Second chop glanced as debris struck my shoulder and spun me half around. The rope snapped tight at my waist and held me in place long enough to get my footing again. Pain flared from collarbone to neck, hot and immediate, but the arm still worked. I changed tactics. The cable ran to an anchor point buried under silt near the snag root. I jammed the axe blade down and hacked at the root and mud around it, working by feel more than sight. Brown water surged to my hips. The young one coughed, tried to rise, and slipped back. I kept chopping. On the 5th strike, something gave under the mud with a dull pop. The cable lurched loose by 6 inches. Enough. I dropped the axe, grabbed the loop with both hands, and twisted hard to open it. The steel bit my palms through wet gloves. The young one kicked once, then went limp. I shoved the loop down over the heel and off. The cable snapped away into current and vanished. "Now," I said through my teeth, though nobody needed the word. I hooked my arm under its shoulders and dragged with the current, angling toward the near bank where mud rose to grass. The body was heavy and half-conscious, dead weight 1 second and fighting weight the next. Twice water rolled us sideways. Twice the rope at my waist caught and let me reset. Scout gave one sharp chuff from above, a tight burst I had not heard from him in weeks. My boots found gravel, then root, then sod. I hauled the young one onto higher ground and collapsed to one knee beside it, chest burning. It lay curled, shivering hard, one leg held stiff and wrong. The cable mark circled the calf, swollen and raw where hair had stripped away. No heavy bleeding. Good. The foot was cold but pink under mud, which meant flow was still there. I opened the field tin with shaken hands. My mother's yarrow salve, wrapped gauze, adhesive tape, antiseptic wipes, folding scissors. I cut away matted hair around the worst abrasion, cleaned mud with canteen water, then pressed dry cloth to the groove until seepage slowed. I worked salve around, not into, the raw ring, and wrapped the leg with gauze and a torn strip from one towel. The young one flinched, teeth showing for a second, then stopped when I kept pressure steady and did not pull away. Rain hammered down. The channel kept climbing. I looked uphill. The adult was still there at the tree line, rain running off shoulders, head tilted toward us. It took one step forward, then stopped when I lifted my hand, palm out. Not a command, a boundary. Give me room to work. It held. I could not leave the young one on that bank. Water would take the shelf before dawn if the surge kept rising. I needed heat and dry shelter now. The cabin sat 60 yards upslope through slick grass and one narrow gate. I slid the wool blanket under the young one as far as I could, rolled the edges tight, and used the rope as a drag line around the bundle. The first pull moved it only inches. I reset my grip and pulled again, leaning my weight through hips like dragging hose up scree. Scout ran ahead to the gate, circled back, then ran ahead again, checking my line. Behind us, the adult shadow kept pace in timber, always parallel, never closer than the alder edge. At the gate, I had to stop and breathe. My shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat where debris had struck me. I unlatched with numb fingers, widened the opening, and dragged the bundle through. The young one made one hoarse sound and tried to rise. I knelt, pressed a hand gently to its chest, and waited until the tremor passed. "Almost there," I said. The mudroom threshold was too narrow for the full drag, so I dropped the rope, got both arms under the young one's shoulders and hips, and lifted in short bursts. It was lighter than a grown man, but dense, all muscle and soaked fur. I got it over the sill, then into the main room by the stove. Heat hit us in a dry wave that smelled of fir smoke and iron. Scout stopped 3 feet away, hackles halfway up, then eased when the young one did not lunge. He lay down between us and the door, head high, watchful. I stripped off my wet gloves and jacket, fed 2 split rounds into the stove, and opened the draft. Flames climbed fast. I spread the second towel and a canvas drop cloth by the hearth, then eased the young one onto its side where heat could reach without scorching. Its shivering came in violent bursts, then longer pauses, then bursts again. I worked through the next hour by tasks. Cut away more soaked fur around the wound. Check for fracture by gentle palpation from hock to knee. Tender, swollen, but no obvious break. Rewrap with dry gauze. Rub limbs with dry cloth to bring warmth back. Hold a cup of lukewarm water near its mouth and wait. The first time it turned away. The second time it took a little and coughed. The third time it swallowed. Outside, floodwater struck the lower fence with a dull, repeated thud. I heard one post crack and go. I could not go out and fix it. Not yet. Near 2 in the morning, lightning flickered beyond the ridge and showed the room in white edges. In that flash I saw the young one's face clear for the first time at close range. Brow heavy, nose broad and flat, lips split at one corner from cold and strain. Eyes half open, tracking me, then Scout, then the stove. Not wild, not vacant. Present. I warmed potato mash in a pan with water and a pinch of salt, cooled it, and offered a spoonful on my palm. It sniffed, hesitated, then licked once, and swallowed. I gave no more for 10 minutes, then another small amount. Slow and steady, same rule as any shock case. 3 days of rain had soaked every board and beam in the cabin, and still the stove drove back a narrow circle of warmth. I sat cross-legged on the floor beside the hearth with my back against the couch, and kept one hand near the wrapped leg to feel temperature and swelling. Scout inched closer until his flank touched my boot. He sighed once, long, and rested his chin on his paws. Sometime after 3, the shivering eased. Breathing settled into deeper pulls. The young one shifted, tested the wrapped leg, then laid its head down on the folded blanket and watched the fire. I took that chance to rinse bloody mud from the towels in a bucket and hang them by the stove line. The water in the bucket went brown, then clearer on the second rinse. I opened the notebook on the table and wrote only what mattered for care. Time extracted, cable removed, leg constriction, soft tissue injury, no major bleed observed, warmed by stove, oral fluids tolerated. I tore the page corner and marked next check intervals in pencil so I would not trust tired memory. By the time the clock hands neared 4:30, rain was still hard, but no longer building. The creek roar held level instead of climbing. I fed one more split round into the stove and sat back down on the floor. The young one's eyes closed and opened, each time a little slower. Scout slept at last, one ear still tipped toward the door. I stayed there in wet socks and a dry shirt that smelled like smoke and salve, listening to water move past the cabin and heat tick through old iron, keeping watch until first light found us where we were. First light came in thin and grey through the west window, and for a while nothing moved except the stove flame. The young one lay on its side where I had bedded it, breath deep and even now, one hand curled against the blanket edge. Scout woke before I did, lifted his head, and watched the door. He did not growl. He held still and listened. A soft weight pressed the porch boards outside. Then another. Slow, careful, close. I stood up with my knees stiff from the floor, raised both hands where they could be seen, and unlatched the door. Rain had softened to a fine mist, and dawn sat low in the trees. The adult stood at the threshold, filling the doorway from my chest up to the frame, dark hair hanging in wet ropes over broad shoulders. Water ran from its forearms and dripped to the mat. It did not bare teeth. It did not lean in. It looked past me once, toward the hearth, then back to my face. I took 2 steps backward and lowered my hands. "It can come out when it is ready," I said, voice low and plain. The adult's eyes held mine. They were deep-set and amber-brown in the weak light, steady and awake, not wild and not angry, just knowing. I felt that look all the way through me, the way I used to feel a wind reading on a ridgeline, exact and impossible to fake. It knew what I had done. It knew what it had asked of me in the rain. It also knew I could have done otherwise. Behind me, the young one stirred. The blanket rustled. Scout looked back once, then returned his gaze to the doorway and lay down again with his chin on his paws. The young one pushed itself upright in stages, favouring the wrapped leg. It made a short, breathy sound, then steadied with one hand on the floorboard. I stayed where I was. No reaching, no urging, just room. It turned its head toward the adult and froze, ears and shoulders lifting as if listening through bone. The adult answered with a small movement I almost missed, one hand opening and closing once at waist height. The young one rose, tested weight, and gave a sharp flinch at the leg, then took one step, then another. By the time it reached the threshold, the room held only stove crackle and creek roar. At the door, it paused and looked up at me from arm's length. Mud still matted the fur along its flank. The corner of its mouth was split and healing. Its eyes met mine and stayed there for a long breath. I did not see panic in them. I saw strain, fatigue, and a kind of deliberate attention that felt older than language. I touched my own chest once with my fingertips, then pointed down to the wrapped leg. "Keep it dry," I said softly. 3 nights if you can. It watched my hand, then reached out and touched the sleeve of my shirt with 2 long fingers, light as a leaf landing. The contact lasted 1 heartbeat. Then it withdrew, turned and stepped onto the porch beside the adult. The adult moved first, angling off the porch and into the yard without hurry. The young one followed, limping but upright. At the edge of the grass it looked back one time toward the door, then continued downhill along the alder line where footing stayed firm above the worst flood run. They did not vanish all at once. They crossed through mist and tree trunks and became part of the timber by degrees. I stood in the doorway until the shapes were gone. Then Elk Creek hit the lower fence with a force that shook the ground under my boots. I grabbed rain gear and shovel and ran for the drainage trench with Scout at my heel. The creek had crested against the outside bend and was throwing brown water toward the lower bench in hard surges. One post had already gone. The emergency rock line I set in March was holding in 2 places, and failing in one where a root ball had jammed the outflow. I dropped to my knees in cold mud, heaved rocks clear one by one, and reopened the channel by hand until water found the trench and started pulling off the yard instead of into it. By 7:30 the rain thinned again, and the first hard push of flood passed. The lower fence leaned but stayed mostly in line. The side channel where I found the young one had widened and chewed out a fresh bank, but it no longer climbed. I walked the edge with my axe and cut loose 2 hung branches that could have dammed the trench on the next pulse. Scout kept watch upslope, ears forward, then relaxed for the first time all night. Near the cottonwood snag I found the freed snare cable caught in brush against a gravel bar, one end frayed where my axe had struck, and bent it. I pulled it out, coiled it, and carried it back to the shed. I tagged it with date, location, and flood conditions on a strip of masking tape and hung it on a nail over the workbench. Not forgotten. Not dismissed. By noon, cloud cover began to break in torn strips over the ridge. The creek was still high, but the waterline had dropped the width of 2 fingers on the gauge stick. I ate standing at the counter, half a cold potato and coffee gone bitter on the stove, then sat at the table with the notebook open and wrote everything from the door knock at dawn to the trench clearance and cable recovery. No flourish, just facts, times, distances, body condition, and weather. I printed the camera photos from the trough track and sealed them in a manila envelope with the field sketches, then marked the front. Elk Creek Spring Log, private. That afternoon I drove to the ranger station at Packwood because the snare line had not come from nowhere. The road was washboard and standing water, and the station office smelled like wet wool and copier toner. I left the location coordinates and cable notes with the duty ranger, a woman named Reeve who wrote fast and asked practical questions. "Old poacher set, maybe," she said. "We will sweep that drainage once access opens." She did not laugh. She did not press me for stories I did not offer. I thanked her and drove back before dark. When I reached the cabin, Scout met me at the porch with his whole body wag, then stopped and looked past me toward the timber. On the top step sat 3 smooth stones stacked in a narrow tower, balanced so precisely I crouched before touching them. Beside the stones lay a strip of willow bark, folded over itself twice, like a bandage wrapped and tucked. I left both where they were until morning. 2 evenings later, just before dusk, I saw 5 figures at the far tree line above the side channel. They stood spread across the slope among cedar trunks, each one still and upright, different heights, same broad-shouldered frame. The adult I recognized by stance stood nearest the young one, which held its injured leg high for a step and then set it down carefully. No sound came from them. No threat display. They watched the cabin, then me, for the length of maybe 10 breaths. I took off my cap and held it at my side. Scout sat at my boot and did not make a sound. After that, the tallest one turned first and moved uphill. The others followed in order, young one in the middle. They passed through timber and were gone. By the second week of May, the leg tracks near the creek had evened out. The drag in one print faded, then disappeared. I still left food at dusk on the flat stump, smaller portions now, mostly fish and potatoes and apples when I had them. Some nights it was taken after dark. Some nights, while the light was still thin, I saw one dark figure step to the stump, lift what I had left, and pause long enough to set something down in return. A twisted cord of grass, a feather with clean shaft and unbroken vein. 2 pine cones nested point to point. I kept my side of the pattern the same. No chasing, no floodlights, no trails cut toward their roots. I repaired fence, split fir, cleaned ash, checked trench flow after rain, and logged each exchange in the notebook with date and weather. Scout settled into it the way old working dogs settle into a gait schedule, alert when it was time, calm when the task was done. In June, I opened a cedar box my mother used for sewing scraps and lined it with wax paper. I moved the early gifts into it one at a time. Both willow crosses, the first raven feather, the braided strip, the nail trio from the shed floor, and 1 pine cone from each heart shape that had arrived on the porch. I wrote a card for the box lid in block letters. Found at cabin perimeter. Spring thaw, no hazard behavior observed. The rest I left outside when they appeared because not every sign was meant to be kept. By midsummer, Elk Creek ran clear again over stones I could hear clicking in the current at night. The lower fence stood straight after 2 more post-resets. The side channel healed into a new path and held through thunderstorms. I slept deeper. I still woke some nights with fire in my chest and Eli's name in my mouth, but now I could sit on the porch steps, feel Scout's weight against my boot, and let the dark be inhabited without feeling hunted by it. In early September, I hiked to the East Ridge where service came in one narrow bar and called Eli's sister for the first time since the funeral. We spoke for 12 minutes. She cried once, quiet and controlled, and told me she was glad I finally called. I told her I was working my mother's place and keeping busy. That was all. It was enough. By first frost, dawn came sharp and pale, and the porch boards held a thin white edge in the shade. I opened the door with coffee in my hand and found 2 pine cones and a single crow feather arranged in a small heart beside the top step, points turned inward, exact as a carpenter's mark. Scout eased down beside my boot and sighed, old bones settling. I sat with him there until the sun reached the rail, looking at that small shape and listening to Elk Creek move below the cabin, and for the first time in years, I was not living like a man waiting to disappear. I stayed on the step until the frost line melted off the porch boards and the pine cones darkened with dew. Scout slept with his ribs against my boot, twitching once in a dream, then settling deeper. The crow feather lay between the cones, shaft straight, down tuft, lifting in the morning draft from the creek. I did not move it yet. I watched sunlight climb the far older trunks and listened to Elk Creek run lower and clearer than it had in months. When the sun reached the rail, I carried the heart inside on a dinner plate so the shape would hold. I set it on the table beside the cedar box and pulled up a chair. The box still smelled faintly of my mother's thread wax. I unfolded the wax paper bundles and laid each item out in a row. Both willow crosses, the braided strip, the 3 aligned nails, the first raven feather, 1 pine cone from each earlier heart, and the strip of bark folded like a bandage. Then I took the notebook and wrote a clean index on fresh pages, 1 line per object, where found, date, weather, condition, and what I believed it signaled. Scout lifted his head while I worked, watched my hands, and went back to sleep. At noon, I moved to the shed and took down the snare cable from the nail over the bench. Mud had dried in the frayed strands where it caught on brush. I brushed it clean, coiled it tighter, and slid it into a feed sack with the tag still attached. I added a copy of the coordinates I had given Reeve and one printed photo of the side channel bend after flood crest. Gauge stick visible for scale. I taped the sack shut and wrote on it with a marker. Recovered Elk Creek side channel. Submit to USFS law enforcement. I stood there with the marker in my hand longer than needed, then set it down and closed the sack. 3 mornings after first frost, a white Forest Service truck came up the gravel track just after 9. I heard it before I saw it. Tires clicking stones, engine idling low. Reeve stepped out in a green rain shell, clipboard under one arm, boots already muddy. She nodded once at Scout and once at me. "You reported old snare line in spring runoff," she said. "I said we would sweep." "You did," I answered. She took the feed sack from my hands and checked the tag. "Our crew got into that drainage yesterday. We pulled 2 more anchor loops from upstream, both old. No fresh bait stations, no recent camps. We flagged the whole side channel and entered it for patrol checks." "That is good," I said. She looked past me toward the lower bench where the new channel cut through alder roots. Her eyes paused on the ground near the stump, then shifted back. "You had unusual track notes in your report margins." I kept my face level. "I had track notes in my notebook." She held my gaze for a breath, then clipped her pen to the board. "If you find wire again, call Packwood Dispatch. You know the ridge for signal." "I know it." She signed my receipt copy on the truck hood, tore it free and handed it over. On the line for disposition, she had written, "Evidence received, hazard removed from field, case closed pending new fines." She did not ask me for stories. She did not offer one. She put the feed sack in her back seat and drove out the way she came. The dust hung low in cold sun and settled on the blackberries by the gate. I folded the receipt into my notebook behind the flood pages. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter with a rake and shovel, not from worry, just from habit. At the trough, I found one old print preserved in shaded mud where frost had held the edge. I measured it again out of routine, 14 at length, broad at the forefoot, no claw marks. I took one last photo with my boot beside it, and then smoothed the print over with the back of the rake, not to erase it from memory, to leave the place plain. At the stump, I found 2 spruce tips laid side by side, each snapped to the same length. I picked one up, turned it in my fingers, and set it back exactly where it had been. Near dusk, I hiked the east ridge with my phone in my chest pocket, and Scout pacing slow behind me. Service came in one thin bar by the snagged white pine. I called Eli's sister again. She answered on the second ring and went quiet for a moment when she heard my voice. "I am at the cabin," I said. "I wanted to tell you I am keeping it." She breathed out, steady. "I was hoping you would. I am still working through papers, but I'm staying." "That sounds like you found your footing," she said. I looked west toward Goat Rocks, shoulders already blue in evening shade. "I found a routine I can stand inside." We talked about small things after that. Weather, her son's school schedule, the way smoke season had been light this year. Before we hung up, she said, "Eli would have approved of you fixing fences instead of running from them." I held the phone a second longer after the call ended, screen gone dark in my hand, then put it away and started down before full dark. Back at the cabin, I lit the porch lamp low and carried the cedar box to the table one last time. I added Reeves' signed receipt under the card in the lid. I added a contact sheet from the track photos and wrote analysis complete beside it, with date and initials. For the 2 objects I had not kept, the cedar sprig, laid across the crate and the circle of clipped needles that had weathered away. I made a final notation. Observed in field, no retained sample, environmental loss by rain. For the stones that had balanced on the fence post in the step, I wrote, left in place by choice. No further handling. Then I closed the box, wrapped it in oilcloth, and set it on the top pantry shelf left side, where dry beans used to sit in my mother's hand-lettered row. After full dark, while Scout and I ate potatoes and venison at the counter, a soft tap sounded once against the porch rail. Not a branch strike, a placed, wooden sound. Scout raised his head, ears forward, then lowered it again and finished his food. I rinsed our plates, set them in the rack, and waited 10 minutes with the lamp still low. No second tap came. No weight crossed the boards. When I opened the door, cold air rolled in clean off the creek. On the top step sat 3 things, 2 pine cones and 1 crow feather, arranged in the same small heart I had carried in on the plate that morning. The cones matched in size. The feather lay centered, quill toward the threshold. Beyond the rail, the alder line was dark and still. "I see it," I said softly. No shape moved in answer. No sound came back except water on stone. I left that heart where it was. I sat down beside it with my coffee cup, warming both hands. Scout circled once and lowered himself against my boot with a long, old dog sigh. Frost brightened along the rail and the edge of the step, and the first stars came through between cedar crowns. Down below, Elk Creek kept its winter voice, steady and unhurried, and I sat in that small pool of porch light, with pine cones and feather at my knee. Alone on my mother's mountain, no longer waiting to disappear.